Good evening, everyone. I'm Judy Rabinovitz, Certified Educational Planner, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to this evening's presentation about the new digital SAT. So we are recording, and you will be able to get a copy of this and watch it again in the future. We're on Facebook as well as YouTube. And I'd like to let you know that there are a number of downloads available for this evening's webinar. Much of what I'm going to cover will be in some of these downloads. If you just go to our website, scorewebinar.com, that you'll find these downloads right below the webinar description. So without further ado, let's start talking about the SAT, college admissions, and especially the new format digital SAT. So what you can see on your screen in front of you are the 10 pretty much most important factors that colleges will consider as they are reviewing applications for admission. And even though so many schools are test optional, you can see that solid SAT or ACT scores still play a very, very significant role. But let's stop for a moment just to briefly consider what test optional actually means. So it doesn't mean, oh, I'm going to decide not to take the test, not submit my scores because it's really optional and, I'll just take my chances on everything else. That's actually not the way I would advise students to do it, because test optional means that colleges will still use your SAT and ACT scores if they are submitted. And so if you don't submit them, everything else plays a much larger role. In other words, your academic record, your essays, your extracurricular commitment. But what has happened with the start of the pandemic and so many schools going test optional is that many, many more students have applied. Colleges have not added many, many more beds, so it has made college admissions more competitive. And as I said, without scores, it means that there is increased, emphasis on the other really top factors, and that they have to stand out even more without scores. And it's truly your decision whether to submit scores or not. And I will tell you that kids are doing today what I'll call differentiated score reporting, which pretty much means based on where my final highest score is, whether SAT or ACT, I will send it to some colleges. I might not send it to all. It just depends if I feel my scores are going to make me competitive. And so that's a whole other subject for discussion. But I will tell you that based on the limited data that's been available, that students who submit their scores do tend to be accepted at a higher rate than students who don't submit scores. I'm not going to tell you that there's cause and effect, but typically kids who have higher scores tend to have stronger academics and other factors. Anyway, if you'd like a list of the current test optional colleges, if you go to fairtest.org, it's completely up to date with listing all the test optional as well as test blind colleges. And test blind means that they absolutely do not look at your scores for purposes of admission, like, for example, the University of California System Schools. Our 12 state universities here in Florida have never gone test optional. They do require scores, and so does Bright Futures. And there are definitely other high-profile colleges that require scores like MIT and Purdue, Georgia Tech, UGA, and there are others. And I did want to show you the data that we have. Many colleges are pretty reluctant to share the data in terms of admission rate for students who submitted scores versus students who did not submit scores. And unfortunately, we don't have this year's data because colleges have been, let me say, perhaps somewhat reluctant to share percentage admitted based on, submitting and not submitting. And I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that, what it means. But I'll also tell you that at the start of the pandemic, when people questioned, does test optional really mean test optional? The National Association for College Admissions Counseling did have a pledge that said, yes, test optional really, really, really means test optional. We will not hold it against you in any way. And although at that point, again, well over half of all colleges, and I want to say that there's perhaps around 3,000 colleges, fewer than 600 of them signed the pledge that test optional really means test optional. So I will let you draw your own conclusions about that. Okay, so get ready. The next PSAT, which is going to be given in October of this year, is going to be digital. So goodbye paper and pencil test for that PSAT. And here's a calendar pretty much showing you the timeline of when we're going from paper and pencil to actually digital tests, both PSAT and SAT. And the important thing to know is that the first digital SAT in the United States is going to be on March 9th of next year. That is a test that many current sophomores are going to consider taking because they will then be in their junior year, and March, middle of second semester, is often when juniors start their testing for the SAT. So let's sort of just take an overview glance, at the digital PSAT and SAT and what they really mean. So, over the years, there have been lots of changes in the SAT, but this is truly the very largest one that College Board has, ever announced. And students will be able to take the PSAT or the SAT on their own computer or tablet, or wherever they're taking it, whatever the test center is, their own high school or some other school or location, you have the choice of using your own computer or the test centers. And I will strongly advise that if you have a relatively current laptop and you're used to its keyboard and all its functionality, that is the computer you should take the test on, because you will be the most comfortable. Okay. It is what's called an adaptive test, and I'm going to go over that in much more detail because paper and pencil tests are not what's called adaptive. So let's just table that for a moment. I will come back to it. It is the same 1,600 point scale as it currently is. It would be a maximum of 800 on reading, writing, and a maximum of 800 on the math. And College Board says that the new score of the 1,600 is perfectly equivalent to the old score, which also means that any concordance tables that you may have comparing SAT to ACT scores are going to be just fine. They'll be completely workable. The new digital SAT score you'll be able to compare to an ACT score and certainly to a previous SAT score taken paper and pencil. And unlike the current SAT, which only allows calculator on one of the two math sections, the digital SAT and PSAT will actually allow the calculator on all of your math questions. So you current sophomores, the class of 2025, you are the first class in the United States to take the digital SAT, not as a pilot, but for real. Students in other countries have already been taking the digital SAT because it was introduced internationally before being introduced here in the US. And the kids who are currently juniors really don't have to worry very much at all about this new format or prepping for it, because chances are you will finish your testing either this year at the end of your junior year, perhaps even this summer, or early fall, sometime during first semester of your senior year. The only time you might have to consider taking a digital SAT if you're currently a junior is if you haven't reached a high enough score yet to get into, to make yourself more competitive in the colleges that you're looking at, or if you're applying for, say, Bright Futures, which will accept a score through the end of your senior year. Okay, one other thing that I'd like to make a comparison for that's not on this screen is that currently the PSAT is a shorter, easier version of the SAT. Okay. It's made up of older SAT questions that may have been tested 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 9 years ago. And it is a little shorter and it is a little bit easier, but it is formatted pretty much the same way. With the digital PSAT and the SAT, they will be exactly the same format, the same number of questions, the same organization. Yes, the digital PSAT will have easier questions, but it will be exactly the same length, the same format as the digital SAT. So one of the cool things about these digital tests is that they are getting shorter. The current SAT, for example, is 3 hours, but the digital PSAT and SAT will each be 2 hours. And the way they're doing that, number one, is because it's an adaptive testing. You'll see very soon what I mean by that. But the long reading passages are gone. You're no longer going to have to read, a several hundred-word passage that might be followed by, say, a dozen questions. It will be a single question with a short reading passage. And the same thing will be true of the writing. In fact, reading and writing are going to be merged together into one section. So in addition to it being shorter of 2 hours, there will be fewer questions than there were in the past, which means you're going to have actually more time per question. And you're going to get your score back in a matter of days as opposed to a matter of weeks. So I think all of these things are really pretty cool. So now let's dig a little bit deeper and talk about what do we mean by, what is its format and what do we mean by the fact that it is adaptive. So an adaptive test is one that sort of, I want to say, learns from you based on how you answer a question. Your next question is either harder or easier, depending upon whether you got a question right or wrong. So the SAT and PSAT are going to be what's called section adaptive. It's not based on how you do on, say, question 5 is not going to determine question 6 in terms of its difficulty. It's actually going to be more like how you do on a section is going to determine your next section. And actually, it's going to be broken up into what are called modules, which my next screen will show. But let's start with the fact that there are 2 sections, a reading and writing merged together, and then a math section. So in the current SAT, there's a separate reading section and a separate writing section, the writing being grammar, not an essay. And there are 2 math sections, one that's with calculator, one that's without calculator. But the new digital SAT, PSAT adaptive, section 1 is reading and writing combined, and section 2 is all of math. However, each of these sections is divided into 2 separately timed modules. So reading and writing module 1 comes before reading and writing module 2, and then comes math module 1 and math module 2. So separately timed, completely separate modules. You can think of a module as maybe being a subsection, if you like. And what's going to happen is that module 1, and it doesn't matter whether it's reading and writing module 1 or math module 1, is actually going to be what's called a baseline module. It's going to be a broad mix of questions that are easy, medium, and hard, maybe even torture, depending upon your ability level. And if I'm sitting next to my 2 best friends at the SAT, one is left and one is right, guess what? The 3 of us are going to have different tests. So if I try to look over here to see what Jason is typing, or over here to see what Karen is typing, they have different tests. So it'll be, again, a broad mix of easy, medium, and difficult questions. And in fact, I might start my test 5 minutes before Jason and 15 minutes before Karen because of the fact that I'm ready. So we don't necessarily all have to start our tests at the same time, and we do have different tests. But again, it will be the same overall level of difficulty, the same number of easy questions, medium questions, difficult questions. And based on how I do in general, and I'll get into more detail on this, on module 1, will determine whether my module 2 is a harder test or an easier test. And so module 2 will be a targeted mix, again, of questions of varying difficulty, again, easy, medium, hard, But if I have the easier module 2, I'm going to have a lot more, let's say, easy and medium questions than I will have hard questions. But if I get the harder module 2, because of how I performed on module 1, I'm going to have fewer, let's say, easy questions, and I might have more medium and hard questions. And based on your total performance on both module 1 and module 2, you're going to get a score in the range of 200 to 800. And module 2s will be different as well. So the student sitting next to me might not have the same module 2 as I have. Now, because this test is adaptive, I expect that some students will sit there as they're taking the test and worry about, oh my God, am I getting enough right to get the harder module and therefore have a chance for a higher score? Or am I getting too many wrong and therefore I'm going to be directed to the lower module? I want you to try to avoid that kind of thinking, because it's only going to hurt you if you waste time worrying whether you're going to get the harder or easier module 2. Now, let's get into even greater depth in terms of these two sections and how many questions we're going to have. And again, module 1 is always the baseline, and module 2 is what I'll call the adaptive module, harder or easier, depending upon my performance on module 1. So in the reading and writing section of module 1 is going to be 27 questions in just over a half an hour. And it's going to be the same thing in module 2. It'll have the same number of questions, and it will also be the same amount of time, actually 32 minutes. You're going to have a short pause in between module 1 and module 2. You'll see it, on your computer when you're going from module 1 to module 2. So you're going to start over with easier questions. And then before you leave as you leave reading and writing and go into math, you actually get a 10-minute break. And I would absolutely take advantage of that 10-minute break, not only to get up and stretch, but please go to the bathroom so that you don't have to do it in the middle of the test and lose time. Okay, let's look at math section. The math section, it's set up very similarly. It's a little bit longer, 35 minutes for each of the two modules, and a fewer questions, only 22 questions in each of those modules. And again, a short pause between module 1 and module 2. And when you're done with module 2 of math, you are done with the test, which is really nice. And I want to tell you that within each module, there are going to be 2 questions that are not scored. It will be impossible to tell which ones they are. They're not going to be the same number. They're not necessarily going to be super hard or super easy. College Board is calling them pre-test questions. Those of us in the test prep industry tend to call them experimental questions, but 2 of them are not scored. They're actually going to be pre-testing them for future tests. Also, perhaps using them as anchor questions that will help determine, how hard or easy a particular section might have been. But 2 of the questions are not going to count, and you will not know which ones they are. So just remember that each student gets a very unique test. They're highly comparable to each other, but they are completely unique. So let's talk about the software that you're going to use, not only for the actual test itself, but for practicing to take the test. So the software is called Blue Book. And you may wonder, how did they come up with that name? Because, there's a blue book in the automotive industry that tells you how much a particular car should cost. If I have a 1957 Corvette, how much is that worth? This blue book is based on the fact that the College Board's official SAT prep book happens to be blue. The ACT prep book happens to be red. So blue is the College Board color, red is the ACT color. And so the app is called Blue Book, and I've given you the link to it on the screen. And that is where you're going to find the digital SAT and actually the real SAT that you will take when you're at the testing center. So when you're practicing for the SAT, you'll actually be able to take tests on Blue Book, and it will simulate the actual experience that you're going to have with pretty much all the bells and whistles of the real SAT. And I would say, please do not ever, ever take the digital SAT without having done some practice tests. So right now, College Board actually has 4 practice tests available on Blue Book. They do plan to add 4 more tests in the summer of 2023. They will eventually add others. They're going to do away with something that's called the question and answer service. Right now with the paper-based SAT, if you sign up to take that SAT in certain months, and in fact, those months are, let's see, October, March, and May, you can actually get back a copy of the SAT that you took, the correct answers, and your answers. They're going to do away with that. You will never be able to get back a copy of the test that you actually took, along with your answers and the correct answers. And what they're going to do instead is periodically release more practice tests. By way of comparison, the ACT has something called the Test Information Release. It's available in December, April, or June. And when you register to take the ACT at myact.org, you will be able to order the Test Information Release if you're taking it in one of those 3 months, which means that within a few weeks of getting back your ACT scores, you're going to get back a copy of the test you took, your answers, and the correct answers. So it's one of the reasons to think about ACT, perhaps, because you can get back a copy of your test and learn from your mistakes. Also, when you take a practice SAT digitally on Blue Book, in order to get your scores and to see which questions you got right and wrong, you actually do need to log into your College Board account. That just seems a little strange to me. Like, why can't you get it directly from Blue Book? But you can't. Anyway, that's College Board for you. Again, if you have downloaded Blue Book and you've practiced on it and you bring your laptop with you to the actual testing center, it's that same Blue Book app that you're going to use. You'll, at the testing center, be able to connect. They'll give you a link. You'll connect to College Board and you'll download the test, the encrypted modules. You'll be able to download them to your laptop. So let's get into something a little bit more complicated and talk about, how is an adaptive test like this scored? So let's make the comparison. The current SAT, every question is worth the same. You get 1 raw score point for every question you get right. You lose nothing for anything that you get wrong. And it doesn't matter whether the question is easy, medium, hard, or torture, whether it's reading, writing, or math, it's 1 raw score point if you get it right. And those raw score points eventually get converted to SAT points on the 200 to 800 scale, but every question is worth the same. Digital SAT is completely opposite. It couldn't be more different. Not all questions are worth the same thing. So what do we mean by that? And this is where we're going to get pretty complicated, but I'm not going to go into any detail. Despite the fact that my background is math and computer science, I'm going to tell you this is like above my pay grade. But for those of you who are math or statistics geeks, know that what they do for scoring on an adaptive test is based on what's called item response theory. And it has to do with the number of questions that you answer correctly, the difficulty level of each question, and the probability of getting it right. And by the way, the probability of getting any question right on the digital SAT, well, other than the what are called the grid-ins, the student-produced responses in math, is 1/4, because there are 4 answer choices, A, B, C, and D, and 1 out of 4 is right. So the chances of getting it right is, 1/4. But the idea of item response theory is to be able to grade a test using fewer test questions, which, by the way, are called items. If you hear the word items, that's the official word for test question from College Board and actually from ACT. And the goal is to be able to differentiate between test takers, even between an 800 and a 780 and a 760, in terms of their ability, on some kind of a trait or a skill, and doing that with as few questions as possible. So every item, every question is going to have an index about how well it can differentiate great test takers from not so great test takers, what level that particular question is appropriate for, and maybe that means, you know, very hard, medium, low, etc. And sort of the chances of guessing, like, and this is basically 1/4 for multiple choice questions. If you really want to know more, and that's about as far as I'm going to go into item response theory. And of course, you want to show off in front of your friends and say, oh, well, the way the test is scored is based on item response theory, but here is a link to explain item response theory much better. But essentially, your score is well, let me back up a moment and say that there are some magic numbers. And these are not from College Board. This is from our own very extensive research. And kids typically will ask, like, well, how many questions do I have to get right in Module 1 in order to get the harder Module 2? So based on, you know, the testing that we have done, we have found that roughly 2/3 in reading and math, roughly 18 questions out of the 27, and in math, not quite 2/3, almost 2/3, roughly 13 out of the 22. But it really depends whether it's not just, say, getting 18 right out of 27. It depends which 18. How many of them were easy, how many were medium, how many of them were hard, and what the other factors within item response theory, the other numbers or codes that are associated below the surface, you know, with each one of these questions. So it is the number of questions and which particular questions you get right that will determine your final score. So it's not just that I got 18 or 22 or whatever number it is right, but it's which ones of those did I get right. So my friend might have gotten 18 right. Maybe I got 18 right, but she might be directed to a different module than I am, and our scores might be very different. So just remember that not all questions are counted the same way.
Question.
Okay, questions.
So what is, do you know what the maximum score is if they don't make it into the upper level section?
Okay, the maximum score if you don't make it into the upper level. Jay, what is it about? Do you think it's about 650? Is that what we know?
Well, what we found in our research was that on the English and the reading and writing section, it's right around 590. And on the math section, it is closer to 530.
Okay, so 530 math, 590 reading and writing.
Give or take.
Right.
I mean, probably 30 points in a section, depending on the questions that you get right or wrong. We obviously have not done every iteration of questions right or wrong, but that's, you know, you're looking at a combined score of around 1120. So say anywhere from probably 1090 up to,
so somewhere in the 1100s. Yeah, somewhere in the 1100s, which is definitely above average. But again, there's only 4 practice tests for us to have experimented on, and within a few years, not only will there be more practice tests, but there will have been many more tests administered.
I'll also add to this that when we were in a presentation with College Board last summer through the National Test Prep Association, their representative told us that basically the way that it's designed, or the IRT algorithm is designed, so that even if a student got into the higher level, they should still theoretically end up with the same score had they not made it to the higher level, based on the number of questions they're going to get right in one level or the other.
Got it. Okay. So now let's talk about, you know, actual content. Oh, sorry. Before I do, let's.
Do you know where the College Board stated that they're getting rid of the QAS?
Where did they state that? Goodness. I mean, I've read it. And I believe if you go into the detailed content, you know, specifications on their website, or it's not just the content, but the detailed specifications in general, that you're going to find it on there. But we do know for sure that they are getting rid of the QAS, the question and answer service, the opportunity to get back a copy of your test.
And if a student brings their own laptop, are they able to bring the charger?
Yes, in fact, you definitely want to bring a charger with you because you may find that your battery doesn't last the full length of the test, and you'll be plugged in for more than the actual 2 hours of the test. So definitely bring your charger with you. Let's just hope the school has enough outlets. So if you're able to choose, so this is a good tip, if you're able to choose your own seat, try to sit near a wall where you can plug in, unless you go to a really modern school that has those wonderful, like, long tables that you can plug in right in front of you.
And the way that the test has actually been designed will save automatically as you're going through the test. So God forbid your battery does die, you're not done with the test. You can reboot your computer, get back online, get plugged in, and the test will resume where you left off.
Right, and you will not lose, any time. So this is very different than the AP tests College Board first gave at home in the first year of the pandemic. Something happens to cut off your power, everything will be saved up to that very second, just like it is on the Common App, by the way. And when you plug back in, you will be able to pick up exactly where you left off, and you will not lose any time. At least that's what College Board is telling us. Any other questions, Jay? And by the way, that's my son, Jason, who runs, all of SCORE at the top, our tutoring and test prep organization, who's, helping me with this webinar.
Yeah, you can move on.
Okay, so let's talk more specifically about content. So reading and writing is mixed together. They're no longer two separate sections, but the passages are super short, and each passage has just one question. And there may be tables or bar graphs or some kind of graphics in there in some passages. And they'll cover the same kind of content as they always did, except there will be more poetry than there was before. But there really won't be very much poetry. And what there is will be from the 1900s, or earlier. So please pay attention in your English class when you're studying Shakespeare and Jane Austen and poetry, but there'll also be science and humanities. And so, in comparison to the current test, some things are definitely gone, and other things you can see on my screen there's more of. And I do want to talk about the vocabulary for a moment, because it seems to be making a little bit of a comeback. And in general, there are 3 tiers of vocabulary words in English. Can't tell you I know the exact definition of all of them, but I can tell you that what is being tested on the digital SAT and PSAT is called Tier 2. And words that are on Tier 2 are words that are, let's say, more common in writing than they are in conversation, but they're a little bit more difficult. They're not completely like foreign esoteric words, but in fact, the word esoteric is a Tier 2 word. Let me give you another example of a Tier 2 word, benevolent. So you can see that there'll definitely be more, vocabulary tested on the new test, and a bunch of other things that you're going to see, as I go into some very specific examples. So the content is broken down into domain, and it's not that important that you understand, like, well, what is craft and structure? What is expression of ideas? Because I'm going to show you examples of them, and basically you're going to see that they are reading and writing questions, not at all dissimilar to what's on the current SAT. But every question is identified with one particular content domain. And there will be questions from all of the domains in every single, in both modules. So the first 2 domains are primarily reading domains, and the last 2 are primarily writing, which I used to think of more as sort of like grammar and sentence structure, and it sort of still is. And the domains always come in that order. So the ones that are primarily reading tend to come first. The ones that are primarily grammar or writing come last, and things that test similar skills tend to appear together. So within each domain, the questions are going to go sort of like easy, medium, hard, easy, and then the next domain will start again at easy, medium, hard. Whereas the one that's standard English convention is going to test your skill first, and then easiest to hardest. Honestly, the important thing to know is that this whole section doesn't progress from easy to medium to hard. It's small steps. It's easy, medium, hard, then it's easy, medium, hard. There might be some variation within it, but each time we're getting to a new domain, it will start over again as being, easier. So let's go into just a little bit more detail. I'm going to show you some actual test questions. These were taken directly from a sample College Board test. I'm not going to leave these questions on the screen long enough for you to try to answer them. I just want to give you an idea of like how long they are and sort of the types of questions. And I'm going to give you what I learned as one of my best strategies as I worked my way through a lot of these questions. And by the way, you may say, well, but Judy, in the beginning, you said you were a certified educational planner. What do you mean you worked your way through this and you did the test? Well, my background is actually in testing. I used to work for Educational Testing Service. That's the company that created, past tense, the SAT for College Board. I consulted to the College Board for many, many years. In fact, I led the entire programming team to develop College Board's first test prep software. And I then wrote strategy chapters about math, because that was my background at the time, for their first test prep book. And as the founder of Score at the Top Learning Center, I trained and created the training materials for, many dozens of fabulous test prep tutors. So I'm totally into testing, although I don't tutor myself anymore. But here's the best strategy I came up with in doing reading and writing, the reading and writing questions. Please read your question first, which you can see here, which choice completes the text with the most logical and precise word or phrase, and then go in and read the passage. Do not start, even though the passage appears first, do not start by reading the passage and then the question. I want to know what it is I am looking for before I read the passage. So this is really common, and we're going to see more of these than we've seen on the current SAT, the vocabulary, in context. So the text structure and purpose, if I read the question first, it wants to know what is the main purpose of the text. Again, a very common question, but now that I know that in advance, I'm reading this passage, this short passage, about thinking in terms of what's the main purpose. And by the way, what I try to do is before I look at the answer choices, and probably 90% of the cases, I'm going to come up with my own answer and then see which answer choice best matches what I think should be the right answer. So these cross-text connections. So in the current SAT, there are double passages where you're reading passage 1, you're reading passage 2, and then there's questions that have to do with passage 1, passage 2, and some questions dealing with both. Well, because this is only one question per passage, and a passage can be a double passage like this, a cross-text connection is typically going to ask you something like, how would the authors of one passage respond to the authors of the other passage? What would they agree on? What would they disagree on? How would they interpret the other passage? So that's what a cross-text connection is. But again, I'm reading that question first. So in this case, I want to know, how the people from the second passage would describe the point of view of the people in the first passage. And they're calling these passages texts, I guess, because they're a little too short to really be thought of as a passage. Okay. The next domain, the information and ideas, they're looking for the main idea again in the text. So yeah, we've seen main idea before. So I'm going to read this thinking about what is the author's main idea and which answer choice most clearly matches what I think of as the right the right answer. Command of evidence was something that was introduced just a few years ago to the SAT, but they're basically looking for evidence that something is true. So in this case, they're looking for something that would support Gimsa and colleagues' hypothesis. I might circle that actually, and you're going to see that there's ways to highlight stuff when you take a test digitally, or I might just use the scrap paper that they give me to write something down about Gimsa and colleagues. But now when I read the passage, I'm actually going to look for that kind of an answer about something that would support their hypothesis. In my opinion, inference questions tend to be a little harder because you're being asked to read between the lines. And in this case, trying to figure out what will most logically complete that text. So I'm going to have to read that whole text through. I know that this is a question that's more I think it's more of a writing question than it is actually a reading question, because I'm adding something to complete the text. Okay, expression of ideas, rhetorical synthesis, whatever that may mean. Again, I'm reading that question first. And this is actually a pretty common question when I've seen this a few times come up now when I did some of the practice questions. A student takes the following notes, and then which of the following would use the notes to accomplish some kind of a goal. So pretty common question. This transition question has to do with the word you're going to put in that blank to make an effective transition from the first part of the passage to the rest of the passage. And are the two things supporting each other? Are they opposite each other? Is one thing is the second part reinforcing the first? Again, a pretty common type of question for the existing SAT. Finally, getting to the last part, I think this is the fourth domain. We're going to be completing the text. And in this case, because the answer choices are so short, I'm actually looking at those answers to see, okay, they're all using the word falling. It's just a matter of, is it going to be followed by, a comma, a colon, or a semicolon, or nothing? So I do have to read most of that sentence, maybe all of it, in order to see, which is the correct answer. I think this is a pretty quick type of a question. I like questions like this because I usually feel I can answer them pretty quickly. And finally, the thing that's called form and question. We're looking about like standard English. Again, it's grammar. What words are going to come in here first? In fact, I might take a quick look to see, okay, it's either going to be the name of someone or, something that doesn't begin with the name, but I have an idea now that grammar question, I can go back and read it. And trust me, this is the fastest way to answer these questions. I'm going to stop to see whether there's any questions about the content in reading and writing. Nothing yet. Okay, great. So we're going to move on to my favorite subject, which is math. Algebra, you can see, is roughly a third of the test. And you'll see that most of the advanced math tends to be algebra as well. So again, just like on the current SAT, algebra appears to be king here. If I don't love algebra all that much, I might like the ACT better because it doesn't have quite as much algebra in it. And just like for the reading and writing, each question belongs to one domain, and all domains are going to be represented in all of the modules. I like this so much about the math. We're definitely going to be going from easiest to hardest. And I'm going to pretty much assume that just like the current SAT, which does go from easiest to hardest, let's say for the multiple choice math, and then again for where the grid in math starts, there are some hiccups. It might go like, let's say we have levels 1 to 10. So the current SAT might go something like this: 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, 4, 6, 6, 7, 6, 8, 8, 9, 8, 9. This is probably going to do something similar to that, but for the most part, it's going to start pretty easy and get much harder. And again, it depends whether you're in module 1 or module 2. Module 1 is going to be more balanced of easy, medium, hard. Module 2 is going to be heavily influenced by your performance on module 1. So let's give you an idea of the types of equations, the types of things you can expect to see in algebra. These are all things that you've learned, pretty early on in algebra, some for algebra 1, some for algebra 2. Here's an idea of one I think of one of the easier questions of a linear equation in 2 variables. But here's a much harder one. It's a word question. And by the way, I don't think I've seen many math questions that are even longer than this. These math questions on the digital SAT do appear to be shorter, more concise, than with less reading. Not necessarily less work or less critical thinking, but less reading than on the current paper and pencil SAT. Typical linear function type of question. Here's a pretty common word question that, has to do with reading something like this and setting yourself up with 2 equations with 2 unknowns. And by the way, you will get scrap paper. I'll talk about that in a minute. And yes, there'll be some linear inequalities. Not a lot different from solving a linear equation, except you have to remember if you're going to be multiplying or dividing by a negative number that you have to flip the less than sign, in this case, to a greater than sign. Okay. Some more advanced maths. This is going to probably, be more of a higher level of algebra. So which expression is equivalent to this? Again, these are things that you see in the regular SAT. You can even prep for the new SAT using many of the old math questions, because they're not all that different. Here's a system of equations, in 2 variables, some nonlinear functions. Okay. Now we get into a different area of math. It's not necessarily algebra anymore. In the problem solving and data analysis area. So, ratio, rates, proportions, these all appear in regular SAT, percentage questions. We're going to get into graphs, in this case, where there's, 2 variable data. And there will be a little bit of geometry and trigonometry. Here's a typical geometry question with lines and angles and triangles. Again, another question from this domain, a circle question, but similar things to what you're used to seeing. So before I get into showing you what these questions actually now are going to look like on your screen, because I just showed you questions, not questions in the context of Blue Book, let me just see if there's any questions yet about math. Nothing. Okay. Phew, maybe I'm being crystal clear, I hope. So let's talk about what do these questions actually look like on your screen. So here's what a typical reading question looks like. Okay, so the passenger reading is on the left. I can see that there's a blank I'm going to have to fill in. But the actual question is over on the right. Remember, I said read your questions first. So even though we're tempted to go from left to right, go from right to left, read your question first. Here's where there's going to be a question related to something that's underlined. A question that has to do with a chart. Yet another question, easy question, pretty short passage to read. Here's one that has 2 passages, text 1 and text 2. And now let's look at the math questions. And just like the current SAT has multiple choice questions primarily, also has grid-in questions that appear at the end of a section that are sort of all together and start again with easy, medium, hard. It doesn't work like that. Here's one change from the current SAT, just in terms of sequence of things. Your multiple choice questions and your grid-in questions are sort of mixed together. So you could go from a couple of multiple choice questions to a grid-in question to some more multiple choice questions. You can go back and forth. And on the current SAT, all the grid-ins have positive answers, either 0 or a positive number. On the digital SAT, they changed that, and you could actually have an answer that's negative. Now, College Board refers to these as student-produced responses. We call them grid-in questions because basically you're not picking from A, B, C, or D. You're coming up with an answer to a math question, like you do on a test in school. So here's what they look like. Yeah, here's one with a graph. Okay, now this one may look, oh my God, there's so much to read. No. The left side that you're seeing here, these are all instructions. This is a grid-in question. And it's really telling you, how to do grid-ins. Like if you get an answer of 3.5, there's no way to really do 3.5. So it might be 7/2, it might be 3.5. It's also telling you there could be more than one right answer, and just you only have to put in one answer. But this is a typical looking grid-in question. And of course, it's very important to have read all these instructions in advance, know how these questions work. I don't want you wasting time. The clock is ticking. Don't read the instructions for grid-ins during the test. That's why it's really important to prep. Okay, so another one has a little bit of a table for a function. Right triangle question. And now we're going to be looking at some features from Blue Book, some very special features that allow you to work through a test more quickly and use the same kind of features that you have available to you on a paper and pencil test. And there's a way to get a similar feature on a computer. So first of all, when you start each module, you're going to get instructions. The one on the left of the screen is the reading writing instruction. The one on the right is the math instruction. Please do not read them on the day of the test. Please read them enough in advance. The clock is ticking. You want to know the instructions so that you're not wasting a single second. The instructions appear, get rid of them and move on. Sorry, we have company. My grand dog Waffle is here. Hey, sweetie. Are you going to take the SAT as well? You want to take the digital test? Yes, you do. I see that. Okay. Say hello to everybody. I know you don't see them. You wonder where they are. Okay. Calculator. Yes, you can still bring your own calculator to the SAT. However, they do give you a calculator. Let's start with this version of it. It's called the Desmos Graphing Calculator. It is probably the most sophisticated online calculator that exists. We are planning on doing a webinar or a workshop about the Desmos calculator, teaching you how to use all of the features you'll need for the SAT. And you can see that there is a way to expand that Desmos calculator. So I can go from just a little calculator for some simple math to something, much more complicated. It's an amazing calculator, and we really can't wait to show you how to use it. But if you don't want to learn to use the Desmos calculator, number one, there's not a single question that will require the use of a calculator. You will have scrap paper. You can do, all of your work by hand, or you can bring your own calculator, and College Board does have a list of allowed calculators. Okay, there's a timer at the top of your screen that will help you with time management. It will show you how much time is left. But if you don't want to see that, if you feel that it will make you nervous, you can hide that counting down calculator. However, what I think is really cool is that you will get an alert 5 minutes before the end of the module, which can, based on how many questions, you've answered so far, you're going to have a sense of, hey, do I have to take my time? Can I take my time on the next few questions because I'm almost at the end? Do I have to move more quickly? Am I going to have to make educated guesses? Am I going to have to make random guesses? It's really nice that you're going to have that warning. Okay. It's very easy to move from one question to the next because at the bottom, you can see at the bottom right, you can hit, the back or the next, and you can move forward or back within the module. Okay. If you want to review the math formulas, and they are the same math formulas that you have on the current SAT, and by the way, the ACT does not have a formula page. It doesn't give you those formulas like the SAT does, but I can click on that word reference in the top right, and lo and behold, I get the geometry formulas for the most commonly tested shapes, the circles, rectangles, triangles, the three-dimensional figures where I might be doing surface area or volume, and have all the formulas. So I can always get them, and then I could collapse them back and get rid of them. Okay. Let's just say that I'd like to annotate my text because I think that there's something that's really important. I can actually highlight it. I just have to click. Let me go back a second. I can just click on that annotate button near the top right, and I can pick my highlight color, and I can my underline style, and I can highlight something that's really important for me. Okay. Then the next one is one of my favorites because I like to work by eliminating answer choices, especially in the reading writing. So I can turn on this answer elimination tool. And when I do, I'm going to see, these little buttons on the right-hand side of each answer. And I can decide that, oh, I don't like those 3 answers, and I can cross them out. I could also uncross them out by clicking on the undo. But this is very helpful for me, just to work more smoothly. And by the way, the elimination tool remains on once you turn it on. So my suggestion is you may want to leave it on for quicker access. You don't have to worry about turning it on and off. You can just always leave it on, and you can eliminate answers when you want to. Okay. Oh, I just got to a question that I wasn't sure of the answer, and I may want to come back and look at the answer choices later, but you need to move more quickly. One of the things you want to do is not waste time on any question and deliberate, oh my God, is it answer A or is it C? I really can't decide. Pick one of them and then mark this as a question to be reviewed later. Because what's going to happen is that when you get to the end of the module, you're going to see that you marked questions 10 and 17 that you wanted to review. And I can quickly go back to question 10 or question 17 or both of them and review them. Okay. I'm going to give you the best tip that we have found so far working digitally is that if you have a touch screen computer, you're going to be able to work probably much more quickly than you would if you don't, because you can actually touch the screen with things that you want to do, as opposed to, working with, a trackpad or a mouse or something to click on something. If you're at all thinking about getting a new computer, consider getting one with the touch screen if you're going to take the digital SAT. But please don't just run out and buy a new computer because, oh, Judy said that you need a touch screen. No. If you have a touch screen, you're likely to be able to go faster. And similarly, if you have a programmable mouse, you may be able to program your mouse that to different clicks mean, advanced, or go back, or, I want to highlight or something like that. So these are just pretty cool tips that we've discovered from our practicing. So questions before I move on. Okay. Accommodations. What if you have a learning disability or a physical disability, and you are used to getting some kind of accommodations on your tests? Can you get it on the digital tests? And the answer is yes. College Board will still provide, accommodations. Something like a large print accommodation may no longer be needed because you're actually able to expand your screen, make it bigger. You might not need, if you previously had somebody reading for you, you may now have text to speech and not need a reader. For extended time, you'll have the appropriate format of the test to be able to take it with extended time. And if you have any kind of accommodation that cannot be provided digitally, you may qualify for a paper-based test. It's not the same as the current SAT. It's not the same as the adaptive SAT, but it does have the shorter reading passages. It's a little bit longer than a 2-hour test, but it is a straightforward paper non-adaptive test if you have some kind of an accommodation that just couldn't be provided digitally. So I'd like to share with you some comments from some pretty early test takers. There were some surveys done of groups of test takers, and I read all their comments and I tried to summarize the ones that appeared, the most commonly. And so of the students who took these pilot tests, who took both paper test and a regular digital SAT. They preferred the digital SAT, perhaps because it was shorter and perhaps because so many of today's teenagers are so computer illiterate, their fingers just fly over the keyboards or their mouse pad, and they seem to score higher. Many of them did on the digital than on the regular paper SAT. Although many of the students, most of the students basically said that the practice tests and their difficulty was pretty much the same as the difficulty level of the digital SAT, the actual test. However, some of them did say that the module 2, whether it was math or reading and writing, was much, much harder than their practice test. So the test sort of felt pretty much the same and the same difficulty level, except for module 2, which many of the kids said that it felt harder than their practices. And many of them did score similarly on their actual digital SAT than they did on their practice test. So one of the test centers didn't have enough computers for everyone, which is a little bit of a problem. Some of the computers didn't last 3 hours and needed to be plugged in. There were proctors who were not well trained and they made students anxious. And the biggest problem that kids complained about was in some centers, the desk was so small that they didn't have room for their computer, their scratch paper, their own calculator, and the mouse, if they were using a mouse. And many kids had to keep the mouse on their lap. It's a little hard to use. So let's hope that wherever it is that you're taking the test, that they are using larger desks, not those chairs where you could sort of fold over, the desktop, because that's going to be really hard for you to keep even scrap paper on with your laptop computer. If you're taking it in the cafeteria, it'll probably be a lot easier because you have more table space to, spread out on. They were all surprised that they didn't all have to start at exactly the same time, but as soon as the student felt, he or she was ready, just start. Those students were able to skip or shorten the break. I have not heard that was the case on the actual test. These were pilots, so I can't promise that you can skip or shorten the break, but even if you could, I wouldn't, because I definitely think that you need to stand up, you need to stretch, you need to go to the bathroom, might need to eat a banana. I've always believed in eating a banana or eating like M&Ms because they give you energy. They also said that they were able to finish early and leave. And again, I have not heard that about the actual test, but some of the kids were reporting that. Okay. If anybody had a blue book issue during the test, it was resolved. Didn't last very long. It was definitely resolved. And every single one of these kids said that you really had to download Blue Book in advance. And you'll get an email, I believe, from College Board about 5 days before you take the test, reminding you that if you're taking the test on your own computer, that you should download Blue Book. So remember, download it way in advance. When you get off this webinar, download Blue Book. And if you don't see the link anymore, if you just Google College Board Blue Book, you're going to find it right away. And by the way, students who had very, very old computers, and they didn't define what they meant by very old, but they said that the Blue Book was not compatible with a very old computer. So this is the time to really test it. Scratch paper. You get 5 pieces. That's it. 5 pieces. What kids said that kept them organized was that they either drew sections on it or they folded the paper so that they could keep each problem in its own separate space. And you could not get any more scrap paper. You couldn't ask for any more. It was just 5 pages. And then and you can use, of course, both sides. And kids said that they felt that if they numbered the questions, and only the ones that they were actually using the scrap paper for, which, by the way, I would tell you every math question should be done in scrap paper. Don't do the work in your head. I have taken the SAT. I'm probably in the Guinness Book of World Records for all the times I've taken the SAT, not as a teenager, but as an adult, and as what I consider a test prep expert. And I can tell you that when I didn't get an 800 in math, which sometimes happened to me, it was because, and I only took it when I could get back a copy of the test that I took, I could recall what I was actually doing. And the questions I got wrong were questions that I tried to do in my head. So even though I've got 2 degrees in math, I actually write out every single thing. You may not need a lot of space for each question, but it's very important to not do your math work in your head. Okay, this was a very interesting strategy. I hadn't even thought of it myself, but it makes, now that I've seen it, I've tried it and it makes perfect sense. I told you that there were 4 domains in the reading writing section. The first 2 were more reading oriented. The last 2 were more grammar or writing oriented. These kids basically said skip, let's say roughly halfway into the reading writing module, and do the last 2 domains first, and then do the first 2 domains, because it's much faster to do the grammar type questions, which tend to be more towards the end, and it's slower to do the actual reading comprehension questions. So it's a strategy you might try. They also said that the vocabulary on the actual digital SAT was harder than on the practice tests. So you may have to go back to doing some vocab, flashcards, but remember they're tier 2 words, and you can Google and get wonderful lists of tier 2 words. And they also said that some of the passages were in Old English, which made them harder. I have a feeling these might have been some of the poetry or a literature that was based on, let's say, stuff that was written in the 1800s. The only one question they had on math was that questions that involved exponential equations were on the digital SAT, but they didn't remember seeing any on the practice tests. Okay, here's what they said about the Desmos. For those kids that had actually reviewed and knew how to use the Desmos, they thought it was fabulous. It was faster than their own calculator, incredibly, incredibly useful. But for those who did not prep at all with Desmos, they did not use it on the actual test. They would have had to waste time to figure out how to use it. So they actually use their own calculators. And just a couple of tips: that you have to use the mouse when you're graphing on the Desmos. You cannot use, your trackpad. You actually have to use the mouse, but you use the trackpad for everything else on the test other than Desmos. And they said that they used a normal calculator for simple math, and they saved the Desmos for graphing and more advanced math. I think until you learn how to use, learn more about the Desmos calculator, you're not going to know yet whether you want to use the time to learn how to use it, which means you could use it for much more than just the SAT, because you can put it, you can have it on your laptop and you can use it, for all of your math, or whether you just want to stick with your own calculator because you love it. Questions?
Couple questions. What accommodations can't be provided digitally and need paper?
Okay. The question is, what accommodations cannot be provided digitally and need paper? I honestly don't know, but I'm thinking, if you had, let's say you had a broken arm, so it's a temporary accommodation. Would that mean that you had to use paper? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. And you might have to Google it. I have no idea. I can't answer that question. Sorry.
So somebody who can't see a screen.
Oh, if you have some kind of a visual, that's a good idea. If you have a visual processing issue and you can't see the screen as well as you can see paper, and you've got the documentation from an ophthalmologist, then you may be able to do a paper and pencil test.
Is there any word that the ACT will be moving online in the near future?
Okay. So is there any word about the ACT moving online? They are not talking about it now. We don't expect any changes from the ACT in the next couple of years. Will they eventually follow the SAT and go digital? My guess is that if things go well for College Board and kids seem to really like the digital test, my guess is that a few years down the road, you might see the ACT go digital. But right now, there's not a single ACT change anticipated, which means that if you want to have a lot of test prep material, because you need a lot of time to prep, you may be a lot better off prepping for the ACT, because we have dozens upon dozens of real ACTs provided by ACT that our students use in prep. We only use real tests.
Will there be more testing dates available now?
Okay, so we're thinking that there may be more testing dates available. Right now, I mean, if you go online, and one of our downloads has the dates as well, you'll see that there is like a single date, for, the March SAT, the May SAT, the June SAT, the August SAT, and those will be digital. The PSAT for this year, this coming year in October, is a whole window from October 2nd through the 27th. And your school can decide which date or dates, plural, on which to administer the PSAT. So not everyone has to take it on the same date or at the same time, but it's that whole month. When they come out with school day testing, and we did call College Board just this morning, they don't have any dates yet for school day testing. In the past, they've had a couple of dates. They said during the week that schools could give the test, that usually schools don't charge. You don't have to take it on a Saturday. You take it in your own school. We're guessing that there will be a window for school day testing. We just don't know when that will be.
That's it. Keep going.
That's it. Okay. So SAT or ACT, which one did you take? Colleges will treat them exactly the same. So you're going to have to discover your own path, whether you might go test optional for some or all your schools because you just couldn't get a score that was at the level that you felt you needed, or you're going to go the SAT or ACT route. I hope you don't have to take both. It's better if you only take one. It's like less prep time. But how do you determine which is better? Well, you could, your actual PSAT or an ACT testing experience can tell you. For those of you who are currently sophomores, my biggest suggestion for you is sign up for the June ACT. It's the second weekend in June. It always is. It's after school ends in Florida. It may not be after school ends in New York, but it's after school ends in Florida. You can request the test information release, which means you will get back a copy of your test sometime over the summer, your answers and the correct answers. You can compare that experience to your PSAT experience and decide which you like better. And one of the really cool things that most people don't know is that you can actually delete or ask ACT to delete a full score report in your ACT, online file on your official ACT record. You cannot do that with College Board. With the SAT, you can cancel a test, but then before you get the score, and usually within 4 business days of taking the test, but you never find out what your score is. On ACT, I can find out my score and I can get in touch. They show you on the website how to do it, but I can cancel any kind of a test that, any kind of score that I want. But if I actually go in as a sophomore and I take the ACT now, the end of June after school is over, I want to do some prep for it. I don't want to prep like crazy. We actually do a week-long sort of boot camp so that you can, cram it all in. It's not the best way to prep, but you don't have to interfere with, your school studies. Take the June ACT and you'll know if you like the ACT or not. And one of the things that you can download from this webinar is going to show you the difference between SAT and ACT, and timing is the big issue on ACT. You do have to move quickly because there's a lot of questions and not as much time as you might like. But there's also not a lot of reading. The questions are shorter, more concise, not as much deep critical thinking as an SAT question. So you don't need necessarily as much time, but you do have to move along. There is a comparison chart, which will allow you to compare SAT and ACT scores so that you'll see which is higher. We give free simulations. You don't have to be a client. If you go to freesimulation.com, you can sign up for a virtual SAT or ACT simulation. We do them right now. Nothing's digital. It's all being done paper and pencil because those are the tests we have right now. But you can take a simulation and see which test you like better. They're real tests, and we're going to score them and analyze them for you. We also have something called a decision plan, where you can sign up for it, where we will give you a special assessment test that's partial SAT, partial ACT. We'll score it, we'll analyze it, we'll discuss it with you, and help you determine, which is your better option. So our simulations are completely complimentary. Anyone can take them. There is a nominal charge for the SAT versus ACT assessment that we offer. So I think what you've been able to tell from everything I'm saying is that you actually really have to prep for SAT and ACT. Please don't just take them and think, okay, this is going to be good enough. Yeah, maybe you might do that for your baseline score, although it's not something I recommend because I don't want you to, have your ego suffer as a result. But when you're looking for a great test prep provider, you really want to find out what they're using for their test prep materials. Are they using real tests? Do they give simulations? Are you going to do full-on tests for homework? What's the personality like of the tutor? How is that tutor going to help, build your confidence? And, base it on, what friends have recommended or maybe a conversation you've had with that test prep provider. But it's really important to pick someone that has a great reputation, who's been doing this for a while, and who's definitely using, real tests. And by the way, has all of their strategies in writing. You don't want to just try to remember all the test taking strategies. I mean, so much of what we teach is strategy. We also teach content, of course, but test taking strategy is incredibly important. So we hope you'll consider doing some prep with us, whether it's individual or small group or even virtual. And finally, we do hope that you'll think about calling us, not just for SAT and ACT prep, but we tutor in every possible subject. You can take courses for credit, for full academic credit, because our learning centers and the schools that we have, and we do have our own schools, they're fully accredited by Cognia, which is what almost every private and public school around us is accredited. That's the highest level of accreditation a school can have. And finally, our college counseling services, we've actually just expanded our staff to handle the number of requests we've been getting for full college counseling, whether you start with us, as a junior or senior, or even start with us in middle school or ninth grade, because there's so much more that we do beyond just helping you decide where to apply and going through that application process. There's lots of preliminary things that we do to really help you distinguish yourself, enrich your life, and improve your chances for college admission. Finally, usually at the very beginning of each school year, end of summer, beginning of school year, we do a boot camp. We typically do it at Suncoast High School, but you don't have to be a Suncoast student. It's a very low cost way to get roughly, 15, 16, 17 hours of college counseling advice, including help with, actual applications and essays, not just your college list. So you may want to learn more about it. And finally, there's other webinars. If you found that this webinar was helpful, there's lots of other webinars on our website under scorewebinars.com. By the way, the downloads I mentioned were at scorewebinarsingular.com. They might eventually gravitate over to scorewebinars.com. Hope you'll tell your friends all about us, and happy to answer any other questions that you might have.
Is it going to be distracting if people are starting and finishing at different times and getting up and leaving?
Yeah, that's a great question. Whether it will be, distracting or not. And I think only time will tell how that is, how far apart kids are. I can imagine that it might be distracting, and therefore I'm going to try to choose my seat very carefully. Like, first of all, I'm going to choose a seat that's close to a wall. And this is assuming I can choose my seat, close to a wall, close to an outlet. And I'm going to try to perhaps sit in the corner. So I don't want to sit, if I can help it, in the middle of the room where I might be distracted by everyone else. And I also don't necessarily think kids are going to be placed that close to each other. I haven't seen yet the actual instructions that are going to be given to the people, to the proctors, in terms of how kids are seating. But yeah, it could be distracting.
If my daughter was going to start taking the SAT in fall of 2023, should we consider waiting until March to take the digital SAT?
Okay. It depends. The question is, should I consider, if I was going to start taking the test in the fall, should I start in March instead for digital? It really depends, first of all, what year your daughter is in. If she is going into her junior year, quite frankly, I have always advised juniors to get your PSAT out of the way, prep for that. And you should prep for that for a lot of different reasons, but prep for your October PSAT. You're going to get your score back really quickly. You're going to see, do I love this test? Do I hate this test? If you that will be digital. If you decide that you can't stand that digital environment, you're either going to switch over to the ACT, and perhaps you'll have taken the ACT at the end of this year on paper, or you might say, you know what, I'm a good student, I'm very motivated, I am going to take the SAT, paper and pencil SAT, in, let's say, November and December, which will be the last tests of paper. You know, it just depends. Some of the kids, most of the kids I've spoken to actually really liked the digital test, but others felt that they need so much more time to prep that the College Board is just going to have, you know, limited resources for at least the first year or so, that they might switch over to the ACT. Take a simulated ACT, or take the real ACT, you know, at the end of the year, and then see if you like that.
If everyone is taking a different test, will the passages be at least from the same categories? Could it happen that someone will have a poetry and someone else won't?
Okay, so that's a great question. College Board is going to, their goal is to make the test completely compatible. So, you know, I'm going to guess that, let's say if the limit to poetry is 2 poems, that all the tests will have, you know, 2 poems. That, you know, there's a certain amount of literature, a certain amount of science-related passages. I think that every effort is going to be made to make the test as comparable as possible. But let's just say that you feel that you've gotten a much harder test. Well, remember that item response theory, you're going to be, you know, graded perhaps slightly differently, because the difficulty level of that question, you know, if you get it right, is going to add more. If you get it wrong, may subtract less. So I think item response theory in an adaptive test may make up for any minor differences between, you know, Susie's test and Mark's test.
That's all I got.
That's all we got, folks. You know, just know that, you know, we'll be, you know, this will be recorded. There'll be, you know, a link sent to you if you'd like to watch it again in the future. Tell your friends about it. Tell your friends about us. Just like to thank you this evening. I hope I've been informative, and, you know, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Thanks so much.